Donald Trump asked for money. Mark Carney gave him exactly what he asked for. And somehow that is the worst possible outcome for the White House. Let that sit for a moment. The President of the United States spent months demanding that Canada spend more on defense. He called Canada a freeloader. He threatened tariffs. He insulted the Prime Minister in public. He made it very clear that if Canada did not open its checkbook, there would be consequences. And Canada opened the checkbook. $40 billion. Real money. Legitimate NATO spending. Officially compliant with every rule the alliance has. The NATO Secretary General confirmed it. The paperwork checks out. The spending is real. The only problem for Washington is where the money is going. It is not going to American defense contractors. It is not going to Lockheed Martin. It is not flowing into the Pentagon's preferred procurement pipeline. It is going to Canadian infrastructure, European technology, and an Arctic defense architecture that Washington has no seat at the table to control. Trump demanded Canada pay. Carney said, fine, we will pay. We will just pay ourselves. This is not a negotiation. This is not a compromise. This is a clean bypass engineered by a man who used to run the Bank of England, executed with the precision of someone who understood that the only way to beat this White House is to make it impossible for them to say no. You need to understand how this move works, why it is so effective, and why the ripple effects are only beginning. Because what just happened between Ottawa and Brussels is not just a story about two countries arguing over a budget. It is a story about who controls the money inside the most powerful military alliance in history. And for the first time in 7 decades, the answer to that question is no longer obvious. Here is what actually happened, stripped of the diplomatic language and the summit photo opportunities. When Mark Carney stood up at the NATO gathering and placed his proposal on the table, every delegation in that room expected the standard Canadian apology tour. They expected promises to buy more American jets. They expected a timeline for reaching the 2% GDP defense spending target. They expected Canada to perform submission in the way that allies have learned to perform submission when this White House is watching. Carney did not perform submission. He performed arithmetic. The proposal Carney unveiled was a dedicated multilateral defense fund capitalized at $40 billion over 10 years, structured around Arctic security, infrastructure, and northern sovereignty. The fund is real. The money is real. Independent financial analysts have reviewed the structure and confirmed that the spending model is sound. The NATO Secretary General's office confirmed within 24 hours that the contributions count fully toward Canada's 2% GDP commitment. Canada is no longer a freeloader by any measure the alliance uses. The math works. The compliance is confirmed. Canada is paid up. Now here is the part Washington did not see coming. The fund's governance structure places decision-making authority in a joint body shared between Ottawa, London, and Berlin, not Washington. The fund's vendor eligibility rules explicitly prioritize what the document calls sovereign northern capability, a phrase that translates directly into non-American suppliers. Canadian icebreakers, Scandinavian sensor networks, British artificial intelligence defense systems. The money flows to allied nations, yes, but the one ally that expected to receive the bulk of it is watching from the outside. That is not an accident. That is architecture. The evidence that this has rattled Washington is not subtle. Within hours of the proposal becoming public, the American delegation at the summit began making the rounds. Senior officials were seen in the hallways seeking bilateral meetings. A verified clip from outside one of the working sessions shows the U.S. Secretary of State moving quickly toward Carney as he exited a room, gesturing urgently, clearly attempting to pull him into a private conversation before the moment passed. Carney stopped. He listened for a few seconds. He gave the kind of polite, professional smile that communicates nothing. And then he kept walking. American diplomats are not used to being the ones running after people in those hallways. They are used to being the ones who summon. The reversal was visible, and it was noticed by every other delegation in the building. Look at the market reaction, because markets do not lie the way politicians do. The morning this proposal became public, shares in America's largest defense contractors showed unusual intraday softness. Not a crash, not a panic, but a visible hesitation, a wobble in stocks whose growth models are built on the assumption that when NATO allies ramp up defense spending, that money flows predictably toward American hardware. Carney's fund puts $40 billion into the system while routing it away from those growth models. Investors noticed in real time. Look at the European response, because that tells you everything about how the rest of the alliance is reading this moment. France issued a statement within hours welcoming what it called innovative multilateral financing for collective security. Germany's chancellor, sitting directly across from the American delegation during one of the plenary sessions, did not look away. He nodded. These are not countries that break with Washington casually. They do it when they sense that the balance of leverage is shifting, and they sense it now. So how did Canada get here? How did a country that spent decades playing the role of America's polite, agreeable northern neighbor end up engineering a $40 billion end run around the most aggressive administration in living memory? The answer starts with a simple fact about power. When you push people hard enough, they stop asking for your permission. The president's approach to Canada was always transactional. Pay for defense or face consequences. Buy American weapons or face tariffs. The implicit message was that American military protection came with a price tag, and Canada was behind on payments. That model worked for a while because Canada, like most allies, calculated that the cost of defiance was higher than the cost of compliance. So they apologized. They promised. They spent money in ways that at least partially satisfied Washington. Then the demands kept coming. Every concession was met with a new demand. Every payment was met with a new invoice. Carney, who understands risk modeling at a structural level because he spent his career managing systemic financial risk, recognized the pattern. The demands were not actually about defense spending. They were about dependency. The goal was not for Canada to be safe. The goal was for Canada to be indebted, to remain in a position where its security choices required American approval. The $40 billion fund is the answer to that recognition. It satisfies the demand in its technical form while eliminating the dependency in its structural form. Canada is spending the money. Canada is not asking for permission about where to spend it. What makes this move so difficult for Washington to counter is that it was designed to be impossible to oppose on the terms this White House usually operates. The president cannot say Canada is freeloading. They are spending. He cannot say the spending does not count. NATO confirmed it does. He cannot call it fake because the structure is real, the capital is real, and the international endorsements are documented. His only remaining argument is that Canada should spend the money differently, which is not an argument any American president can make in public without looking like he is demanding other sovereign nations route their defense dollars through American companies. He has been making that argument anyway. His social media posts this week have called the fund, in his own words, a ridiculous scam, an accounting trick, a way of cheating the system. But here is the problem with that argument, and it is a fatal problem. The system he says is being cheated already reviewed the proposal and signed off on it. You cannot simultaneously claim the referee blessed the move and that the move is illegal. The president is arguing with a scoreboard that has already been updated. This is the trap. He built it himself. He told Canada to spend the money. He just never imagined Canada would spend it without him. And now the consequences are beginning to compound. The most significant consequence is not about Canada at all. It is about what other countries are watching and learning. Germany has a new government trying to position itself as a serious defense actor. France has spent 2 years building the case for European strategic autonomy. The Baltic states, long terrified of Russian aggression and deeply reliant on American guarantees, are watching to see whether American guarantees can actually be trusted. Every one of these countries is asking the same question right now. Can you satisfy America's demands without surrendering control of your own security decisions? Canada just showed the answer might be yes. If that model spreads, the implications are serious. The United States has maintained its dominant position inside NATO, not just through military power, but through financial architecture. American defense contracts are how allied spending gets recycled back into the American economy. American procurement standards are how allied militaries get locked into American technology ecosystems. American approval processes are how Washington retains effective veto power over allied capability development. The Carney Fund is a direct challenge to all three of those mechanisms at once. This is not a small thing. This is a structural challenge to the financial logic that has kept American influence inside the alliance intact for decades. And it is coming from the one country that shares a land border with the United States, the one country whose security and economic relationship with America is so deeply intertwined that any friction between them is felt almost immediately in both economies. The president does not fully understand the weapon being used against him. He understands tariffs. He understands withholding. He understands the blunt force of economic pressure. He does not understand sovereign wealth structuring. He does not understand how to unwind a multilateral fund that has already been legally constituted, endorsed by allied governments, and blessed by the alliance's own administrative apparatus. He cannot tariff his way out of this. He cannot tweet his way out of this. The architecture is already in place. Watch carefully for what happens in the next 3 months. There are 3 directions this could develop. The first is economic pressure. The president cannot attack the fund directly without looking like he is opposed to NATO spending, which is a position he cannot defend. So he attacks indirectly. Canadian aluminum gets new duties. Border crossing times for commercial freight slow down. Energy agreements get revisited. This is the pressure campaign without the press conference, the kind of retaliation that is felt before it is announced. It is the most likely near-term response. The second direction is alliance fragmentation. If the White House decides to challenge whether the fund actually satisfies NATO commitments, despite the Secretary General's confirmation, the confrontation becomes institutional. The United States would be arguing against its own alliance's administrative decisions. That is not a path this administration has shown reluctance to walk. And if it walks it, Canada is not the only country that has to respond. Every NATO member would be forced to decide which side of that argument to stand on. That is the scenario that turns this from a bilateral dispute into an alliance-level crisis. The third direction is the one nobody is saying out loud, but everyone at the summit was thinking, other countries join the structure. The fund, designed for Arctic security, has a governance model that can be expanded. If the United Kingdom, already listed as a co-governance partner in the fund's framework, deepens its participation, and if France decides that innovative multilateral financing is exactly the kind of European strategic architecture it has been calling for, the fund becomes something much larger than a Canadian defense commitment. It becomes an alternative financial spine for the alliance, one that Washington is not running. That scenario does not require a dramatic announcement. It requires 3 or 4 budget meetings in European capitals over the next year. It requires finance ministers signing technical agreements that do not make front pages. It requires the quiet accumulation of commitments that, once made, are very difficult to reverse. This is exactly how Carney operates. Not with noise, with compounding interest. Here is what this moment actually reveals. It reveals that the strategy of using financial pressure to create political submission has a limit. And that limit is reached when the target of the pressure finds a way to technically comply while structurally escaping. Canada has now demonstrated that escape. The demonstration has been witnessed by every government in the Western Alliance. The president demanded money. He got the money, technically. He lost the leverage completely. He is holding the receipt for a payment that does not benefit him, and he has no legal mechanism to reject it. Canada used to be the country that said sorry. It said sorry so often that the apology became a cultural reflex. Mark Carney is not saying sorry. He is saying yes and building something the White House cannot touch with that yes. That is not submission. That is something the president has very little experience dealing with. A competent rival who fights on terms he did not set, using tools he does not fully understand, in a language he has never learned to speak. Trump asked for NATO cash. Carney handed him exactly what he asked for. And in doing so, he may have handed the alliance something it has needed for years without knowing it. A way to be serious about defense without being dependent on a single country's approval to do it. The money is moving. The architecture is built. The allies are watching. The only question left is whether Washington understands what just happened and whether it understands in time to matter.